Hi, folks. My name is Kelly Schaefer, and I am thrilled to be hosting this Talks at Google session with Julia Boorstin. I'm the Google Labs Director, leading the product teams for AI language applications, which is focused on large language model technology. And I am so lucky to be joined today by Julia Boorstin. Julia is one of those people rocking it on so many fronts. She is a seasoned reporter at CNBC. She's the author of the book, When Women Lead, which highlights both the biases that women face, but also the common qualities that make women really uniquely equipped to lead, to grow businesses, to navigate crises. And she's also the creator of CNBC's Disruptor 50 franchise, which highlights private companies transforming the economy. And on top of all of that, she lives a very full life in Los Angeles with her husband and 2 sons. Julia, welcome. Thank you for joining. So glad to have you.
Kelly, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Excited to talk to you too. And I want to jump right in and start getting to know more about you, your book, practical tips for folks watching, and reminder to our audience that we'll have time for questions. So please add your questions to the comment section over in YouTube. I want to start out with actually something you said towards the beginning of your book. You mentioned that you created this workplace identity that was this like hyper professional version of yourself. I think you called it over preparedness and a half smile. And that while helpful, it also left a lot of your personality out. And I'm curious how you evolved beyond presenting with this workplace identity and what suggestions you have for folks who feel stuck with having to act a certain way at work.
I think I was really afraid to show my whole self and to be my whole self because I didn't want to show any vulnerability. And I, entered the workforce at 21 years old, fresh out of college. And I was surrounded by people who were older and far more experienced than I am, as most people are when they enter the workforce. And I think I just was afraid of showing any cracks. And I figured if I did extra homework, I would be extra prepared when the inevitably men who I was interviewing would ask me why on earth I would dare question their business or dare question their business model or their approach, because how could I possibly know anything? So part of my job as a young reporter at Fortune magazine, which is where I started out, was all about asking tough questions to people a lot older than I was. And I just was terrified a lot of the time. And so my security blanket was over preparing and doing homework. But as I got older, and then as I started my career on television, I realized that this like stoic facade wasn't doing me any favors. And I think was actually really damaging my ability to connect with viewers on TV and even to connect with interview subjects. Because if you're always being so stiff and serious, you're not showing what makes you excited and what makes you fired up. And so part of it, I think, was just getting older and more experienced, and also saw that there was like less reason to be afraid. But also seeing that if I showed my personality, then it was more compelling and that people would be able to connect with me more. And I think that vulnerability, there's so many studies, and I write a lot about the power of vulnerability in the book, but real honesty about what you really know and what you don't know. And if you think about like how someone answers a question, how someone asks a question, as we go through our lives, no matter what we do, it doesn't just apply to journalists. Honesty and vulnerability about yourself makes you much easier to connect with. And whether you're working with a team or working, negotiating a deal, you need to have that point of human connection.
Yep, that makes sense to me, and also reminds me of an anecdote in your book. And please correct me if I get the data slightly wrong. But you mentioned like as you got older, you were able to kind of have this renewed sense of confidence and identity. And I remember you talking about how men in their 20s and 30s tend, on average, to have higher confidence levels than women at those ages. And then around, I think it was age 40, it kind of levels out. And then beyond that, actually, women's confidence grows at a faster rate as they build up their expertise and their experience. And I'm curious, like, was that the case for you? And I think even more broadly, that was one of the things in your book that for all the biases that a variety of groups face, that was one where I felt like, oh, here's this nugget of great news, someone like me. And I'm curious, tell us more about that and what other like great news came from your book.
Yeah, there's so many nuggets of great news. This one may not be such good news for men, but overall, I think they're great nuggets for both men and women as they try to find their authentic leadership style and figure out how to succeed in this very complicated workplace that we all live in. So first, I have to say, in terms of being forced that moment when I was really forced to be my whole self at work, it really did start. And I should be honest about this, when I was pregnant on live television every single day.
Mm.
And that was the moment where I was like, I had sort of experimented with being a little bit more open about why I was excited about my job or what I loved about certain things. But when I was pregnant on live TV, I couldn't hide the fact that I was going to become a mom. And there was a lot of awkwardness around that. And people would inappropriately rub my belly on live television without asking me. But there also was just this honesty of like, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Yes, I'm going to be a working mom. And like, what am I hiding myself for anymore? And so I think that was a key turning point. As for that study about women and men's confidence, you're 100% right. I love this study so much because it has resonated with so many people. And this is what it shows. When men enter the workforce, their confidence is up here. Women's confidence is down here. Over time, men's confidence declines and women's confidence increases. So there's like an X of confidence. And the cross happens around 40. Women continue to grow their confidence along with their experience, while men maybe realize, hey, I started off too confident. Maybe I'm never going to achieve these lofty goals I had for myself at 22 years old. And maybe I need to reconcile the fact there are a lot of people out there who know more than I do. So there are a lot of practical reasons why we might see that confidence transformation. But what it also tells me is that women should have higher confidence from the beginning, and that maybe everyone's confidence should be predicated on their experience and their expertise, and not on these sort of weird socio-cultural sort of things out there about what people are capable of and what roles they might adopt. So I am over 40. My confidence has increased. I think actually writing this book and seeing all this data has been a huge confidence boost. And one thing I've heard from a lot of women who have read this book is that just having the data laid out there and having all of these numbers laid bare is in a lot of ways transformative, because you realize, oh my gosh, that thing I experienced is not just me. I am a data point. And once you see that, okay, if I experience that bias, it is not personal. It's entirely part of these broader issues. Then you don't have to struggle with it and take it personally. You can understand it for what it is and move on. And I think that was a big turning point for me and what I learned from writing this book. And I think there's one reason there are 40 pages of endnotes, is that I really wanted to make sure that this book was data driven. And as I start off wanting to write this book, because I want to tell the amazing stories that, Kelly, I know you've enjoyed. There's so many amazing women's stories in this book, but I realized it wasn't going to be enough just to tell the stories. Storytelling is one thing. You need to explain why these women were successful. I had to find academic studies explaining why their approaches enabled them to defy the odds. Academic studies to explain why, if anyone were to apply their skills and strategies to the business world, they can be successful too. So it started as a storytelling venture, and then it really morphed into this research project. And I think that's why this book is so powerful, is because it's not just the stories. It's also the data that is in a lot of ways very illuminating, not only for the stories, but also for all of our own lives.
Yep. And I loved that pairing. I felt like the story kind of illuminated the thing, and then the data validated it, of like, oh yeah, this is the reason why, or this is the data that shows it. I am curious to hear more about either some of the stories or also the superpowers of women that you mentioned in your book, and which ones are really resonating. And just to tell another example for folks who haven't read the book yet, it was really fun to read one of the stories about, I think it was Gwyneth Paltrow, and really experience these same mixed emotions that she had as she was going through the experience of searching for a CEO for her company Goop. And I think she had a couple CEOs prior and was looking for a replacement or something. And she mentioned how, at one point she had this interview with someone who, I think it was a woman, who complimented her on like, oh, wow, you really know your stuff. And in her head, she's thinking, yeah, I really know my stuff. I kind of founded this company and everything. And it helped her realize like, hey, I shouldn't hire a CEO for my company. I should be the CEO. And, but it was one of the things that stood out to me is that, she paired that with also being pretty nervous about talking to her board about it. And I think that was one of the kind of story examples that paired with the data to show like, hey, it's okay to be a powerful woman who also is nervous about asking for something that you probably deserve anyways.
Yeah. And by the way, it was a man who said that.
Oh, it was a man. Okay.
And what he said was he was talking to her about potential CEOs, and he said, oh, gee, you really know your stuff. And she was, the conflicting emotions were, on one hand, she was flattered, and on the other hand, she was insulted.
Yeah.
And I think you could be both at the same time. And it's this sort of mixed standards, these double standards of the minimum standard and the confirmatory standard, which I write a lot about in the book, which explains a lot of these sort of reasons why women are more likely to be considered for a role and then less likely to actually get the role because of stereotypes of what types of people typically hold leadership positions. So that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
So I lost. So
I want to hear more about some of the superpowers that you found commonly amongst women. Yep.
Because yes, and I think it's worth saying, even though I write a lot about the data about the challenges women face, particularly in male-dominated environments such as tech, which I know is your world. The book is really about all the advantages women bring that sometimes have been overlooked. I would say historically have been overlooked. And I do have to note that I wrote this book during the pandemic. This is my pandemic project. I started off baking sourdough. And then once I sold this proposal, I transitioned to 120 interviews and 300 academic studies. But what ultimately I found in those interviews and these studies is that women have key skills and traits that they're more likely to deploy than men are. And these are things that translate to good leadership, no matter who deploys them. So we mentioned vulnerability. Another one is empathy. Women rank higher in terms of empathy. I have an empathy test on my website, juliaboorstin.com. It shows you pictures, black and white pictures of people's eyes, and you can guess what they're feeling. The ability to relate to what someone else is feeling or thinking is not the same thing as kindness. The number of people on my book tour have said, oh, women are just nicer than men. This does not have anything to do with that. And no, they probably are not. But empathy can lead to compassion, but empathy itself can be a very valuable strategic tool in terms of negotiating, working with teams, leading teams, understanding what your team is feeling or thinking. So vulnerability, empathy, a communal leadership style. Women are more likely to lead in a way where they're bringing in perspectives from across an organization rather than hierarchical top-down leadership. Women are more likely to do divergent, or what is sort of like forest rather than the tree thinking, trying to think about big picture problem solving. What is the fundamental issue that needs to be solved rather than trying to put a Band-Aid and rush towards a solution. And then a couple ones that really surprised me is that women are more likely to lead with gratitude. And I never in my whole 20-year career as a business journalist thought that gratitude had anything to do with business. But what I found after I heard a dozen women talk about gratitude in these interviews I was doing with them, I found all these studies showing that gratitude is something that women feel better about. They are more likely to practice gratitude, to think about things they feel grateful about. And gratitude correlates with patience in business. So if you think about what you're grateful for in the moment, you're more likely to go for the long-term win rather than the short-term gain. And, I cover publicly traded companies who always think about are you going for the quarterly beat, or are you thinking about the long term? But this is even more powerful than that. So there were some great studies that I found, and I cite a really interesting one in the book about the importance of practicing gratitude so you could plan for the long term. So those are some of the key skills and strategies that I found. And what I think is most important is that these are things that we should all be embracing, and it's not just women. Yes, women may have an instinct to some of these approaches, but men should be leading with them too. And I write about servant leadership, this idea of prioritizing your employees and your other constituencies, whether it's your customers or in addition to just your investors. And this is something that Howard Schultz really has focused on, and think about his track record at Starbucks, or Fred Smith at FedEx. And so men can have massive success if they lead more like women and take some of these approaches that women have more traditionally adopted. And then the other thing I would just say is I really believe that the pandemic shed light on the importance of these leadership strategies. You can't lead in a way that's not empathetic or is not taking a communal approach and pulling on perspectives from around your organization, especially at a time of crisis. And I hope that this is a turning point to sort of unlock some of these stereotypes and archetypes of leadership and invite everybody to have a more nuanced approach to how their own leadership style can be.
Absolutely. And the pandemic related examples in your book also highlighted, some of the data around women leading through crises and what we can all learn from their style there. I am curious to talk more about how, men and people in general can be a force for good in the workplace. And I'm curious for us to talk a little bit about allyship and, thinking about, for myself, there have been several folks men who have played a really pivotal role in my journey. And I'm curious what some of the characteristics are that you've seen of allies that have really been effective in making for a better workplace for anyone. And also curious if there's someone in your life who's played that role in your own professional journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's this concept of mentorship that's a very traditional idea of this essential thing that's the secret for everyone's success. You need someone who's more senior than you at your organization to take under their wing and help rise you through the ranks.
Yep.
That is a very rare scenario from what I've heard. And everyone in my book has benefited from having a network and a community of people who help them. There are male allies. Everyone has had at least one man who's helped her in her career of the women I quote in the book. But also, I think it's a more nuanced thing. You can have women who are going to be allies for you in the workplace. And I had a very important male mentor at my first job at Fortune magazine who really pushed me to do TV, to push me out of my comfort zone, encouraged me to take risks that I was, again, in my workplace, very serious workplace identity, afraid of taking. Andy Serwer, he's now at Barron's. He was editor-in-chief of Fortune for a while. But I also think it's important to just like shift the conversation about like what it means to be an ally. Women can be allies for each other.
Yep.
And to just sort of neutralize this as from being such a gendered thing. Men can benefit from having more women in their organization. And I think the men that are the best allies are the ones who are doing it not because they think it's a philanthropic gesture, but because they know they'll be more successful if they support the women around them. And I think there has to be a whole shift in conversation away from this idea that DEI initiatives and even like men helping women is like the right thing to do. Sure, it's the right thing to do. Does that matter? Not really, because guess what? People don't always do the right thing to do. People do the thing that's best for business. And all of the data and the 40 pages of endnotes in my book really point to the fact that it's better for business to have diversity. And everybody gets smarter if there are people who are different than them around them. And I guess I went on this tangent when you asked about allyship, because I really think men who believe that it's going to be better for them and better for their team to support women, those are the ones where it's like most authentic. If they're doing it, they can't, it's okay for them to be self-interested. One of the studies I love the most in the book is the one about the Greek, the fraternities and sororities. Do you remember this one?
I think so.
So this is an amazing study. I hope you all read this study because there's a great punchline at the end, but they basically are these academics who tested fraternity and sorority sisters and brothers by putting them in groups of other of their Greek house members with whom they shared a culture and a language, and to ask them to solve a fictional murder mystery. Then they had some of them joined by an outsider who they didn't know, wasn't part of the same Greek house, to see how that outsider impacted their ability to solve this problem. And this is what's so powerful to me. They solved it better when they had an outsider join, but not because the outsider just brought a new perspective. That is the unnuanced version of the value of DEI. Sure, new people, new perspectives, great. What was so amazing to me about this study, and some other ones in the same vein, I think this is the most interesting though, was this idea that when you had an outsider join a group, everyone in the original group actually got smarter. They didn't take things for granted. They reevaluated their approach. They were more cautious about their thought processes. And so I think that the best male allies are those who say, let me spend time with this woman and help her and mentor her or try to support her in her career. Because if I'm surrounded by someone who's different than me, she's going to make me raise the level of my game.
Yep.
And in a world where we're all looking for an edge and an advantage, the men are going to be smarter if they have smart women around them.
Yep, absolutely. And one of the other things, and correct me if I get this slightly wrong, that I think I remember from that study is that at the end, the folks who were joined by someone from the in group actually thought that they had done better. They had higher confidence in whatever their fictional murder mystery answer was. And the folks who had been joined by an outsider didn't feel as confident. And so
it's
that
harder.
Also makes you challenge your own kind of unconscious biases of actually, like, it might feel a little harder, but your results are going to be better.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, and as you can see why I included that study in the book, there's something about this idea that discomfort is good. It's important to embrace discomfort to get smarter. And you're going to be better at whatever your job is if you're a little bit uncomfortable. And sometimes surrounding yourself with people who are different than you is the way to feel that discomfort And it felt harder, but the outcome was better. And to me, that's the ultimate argument for diversity. It's not about just about bringing new perspective. It's about making everyone work harder and get smarter. So yes, I loved it when I would find these studies. I'd be like, oh my God, this is perfectly illustrates the point I'm trying to make in this chapter. But I think, that's what I would say the importance of allyship is. But every woman I know has benefited from a male ally or many. And I think the ones where those relationships are most authentic are the ones where the women also bring something to it as well. There's been a lot of talk about how for mentorship, you need to offer something to your mentor. But I think it's also bring perspective to, if you want a male ally, go to a man and say, I would love to ask your advice on something or talk to you about this thing that I'm working on. I'd love to share my perspective with you and also hear what you're thinking. All of these roads go two ways. Very few roads are one-way streets.
Yep. Yeah. And that also, as you're thinking about, or as you're talking about developing relationships with people who are really different from you, that reminds me of a different type of story in your book that really stuck with me, which was about a male colleague of yours who was a very impressive guy and who also had a social relationship with your mutual boss. I think they played tennis together. And this gave him access to some opportunities that you didn't have because they came up during, post-tennis cocktails or dinner or whatever, and you just weren't there. And I have certainly had times in my career where I felt like, gosh, I'm not part of the in crowd, whether that was related to gender or not. And, because I don't have maybe the typical social relationship with someone, I may not be getting access to the same opportunities. And I'm curious if you can talk more about relationship building and how to, particularly do that if you don't feel like part of the in crowd.
Yeah, it's so funny. And this guy, who I'm still very good friends with, I got his permission before including the story in the article. But what was so memorable about that is that he would go out and play tennis with our bosses, multiple bosses. He'd play tennis with them, and then they'd go out for drinks. And then the next morning, he'd kind of slink into the office and be like, "Oh, Julia, I got that assignment I wanted. I'm sorry."
Including, wasn't it? He got to go to Mongolia to report on the gold rush or something.
Yes, I was so jealous, but I didn't blame him for it. It wasn't malicious, and I think that's the thing about a lot of these sort of social structures. Like, it's not malicious. You just have to be hyper aware to even understand that it's going on.
Yep.
So I would say in terms of building these relationships, I have to think about Jenn Hyman, the CEO and founder of Rent the Runway, because the way she built relationships was so wild to me. And so she sort of accomplished the impossible. So Rent the Runway obviously has really challenged the department store business by, instead of women buying dresses for special events, they rent them, et cetera. So what she did as she was starting off the business as a young Harvard Business School student at the time is she went to the CEOs of department stores and she forged a relationship with them. And I was like, what do you mean you've got these guys to sit down with you? And not only did she get them to sit down with her, but she followed up in such a way, and she offered them her perspective in such a way that she forged these sort of lifelong relationships with them and professional friendships. And she outreached, and with her, luckily she had the Harvard Business School advantage to make those connections. But then she said, I'm building this company. I want to figure out how we could share our perspectives with each other on what's going on in the retail industry. And then ultimately she ended up making a partnership years later with Nordstrom, where you could drop off your Rent the Runway dress at Nordstrom. But I think what was so interesting here is she wasn't afraid to reach out to someone who was outside of her comfort zone and outside of her relationship circle and say, here's what I'm offering to you, but let's talk. And I think with the right introduction, and now especially on Zoom, it's not so hard to do that. But I think one thing I've heard from a lot of people reach out to me, is don't say, I want to pick your brain, or can we just catch up? That's too vague. It's not going to be helpful. If you have a specific thing you want to talk about, say, I would like to talk to you about this thing, this project I'm working on, this initiative I'm interested in creating. Be specific and say, I want to talk to you because you're an expert in this. I know you'll be able to have some insights, and I can tell you what I'm seeing on my end. So I think don't be afraid to reach out to people and try to connect with them. It's helpful if you could find a common contact on LinkedIn or the like. but be clear about what you want to get out of this. You probably know what you want to get out of it, but just saying you want to pick someone's brain is I think ultimately a turn off.
Yep, I would second that. And the other related tip, and it may have come from Jenn Hyman in your book, was I think it was her who, after she would get really good advice, she'd actually follow up like months later saying, hey, I remember that you mentioned this thing, and I just used this last month to do X, Y, Z. And
thoughtful follow-up.
Yes. And that actually builds a relationship.
Yeah. And so write a handwritten note. I'm a big believer in the handwritten note. I know it's very old fashioned. I'm always looking around for stamps, but write a handwritten note. If someone really helps you out, write emails and say thank you. And then what Jenn Hyman did that I think was so powerful is this idea of months and years later, she really was able to maintain these relationships because she would remind someone how valuable their advice had been to her. So if someone gives you great advice, don't just thank them and then walk away. Remind them, I'm using your advice right now. I really appreciate it. And then that person is going to feel invested in your success.
Yeah.
Again, people are self-interested. If you make someone feel invested in your success, they're going to continue to give advice and you'll be able to build that relationship with them more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't second that enough, especially as someone who does occasionally get asked for advice, and you see a wide spectrum of how people do that and how they follow up. And you give time, frankly, disproportionately to people who approach it in a certain way, because you can't talk to everybody. So I love that. Thinking more about Rent the Runway and a lot of these different businesses that have just totally disrupted industries. I want to dig in a little bit more to how you think about disruptive companies. And I know that one of the things you started and you continue to curate is this list called the CNBC Disruptor 50, and it's focused on tech companies that are really redefining their industries. And I'm curious what types of industries you want to see disrupted that you just haven't been able to include on that list yet. So in other words, 2 years from now, what type of disruptive startup do you want someone who's listening to this to start, and then you'll put it on that list?
Well, I have to say, yes, the Disruptor 50 is one of my favorite projects, and it really led me to writing this book because I was meeting all these amazing women who were creating companies that were taking totally new approaches to their sectors or inventing entirely new types of companies. Obviously, femtech, the female healthcare industry, is totally taking off in the past couple of years, and that's something that's really been driven by women. And so all those women I was meeting there, plus the fact that women draw less than 3% of all venture capital funding, or over that the prior decade, it was less than 3%. It's now dropped to 2%. Those facts, and then these amazing women I was meeting, really inspired me to write the book. So yes, I love the Disruptor 50 so much. One trend that I'm seeing a lot of now, and I hope continues, is companies focused on the environment, or companies that are not specifically environmentally oriented, but have a big environmental impact. We've seen a massive increase in purpose-driven companies applying to the Disruptor 50. One of the advantages of doing this list is we have over 1,000 applicants every year. And so we get all this data that we can aggregate to see what the trends are in terms of the startup space. Purpose-driven companies with some additional social or environmental purpose, have increased dramatically over the past probably 3 to 4 years. And last year we saw a big jump. But the idea that companies can have financial success and also have a big and positive environmental impact, I think is a great trend we're seeing here. And there was a cool bee pollination company we saw, a tree reforestation company. And I think it's just important to separate, to not think about, helping the environment as just being a philanthropic endeavor, but saying in financial success, you are going to be helping the environment more. There are logistics companies like Flexport that have that alignment of that. So I hope we see more of those. I think we need to see a lot more of those. As someone living in Los Angeles, we just had this sort of hurricane come through. There's a lot of concerns about wildfires right now. So I think anyone who could figure that out, that would be great. The other sector that I would like to see more innovation is the ed tech space. We have had a couple of education tech companies on the Disruptor 50 list. And there are companies like Guild Education that are trying to enable more blue collar workers to get access to college level education. But I think there's still a lot more to be done. And at a time when there's a skills gap, there's a huge demand for upskilling right now. I hope that there's more work in the education space.
Yep. Love both those suggestions. And going back to the more like social enterprise or social goals alongside profit goals, love one that in your book you call out that women are particularly good at this, which is great. And also you've got some anecdotes in there about Google's Sidewalk Labs.
Yeah.
So have to read on that. I know
Yes,
we've
the
only got a
Sidewalk
couple.
Labs invested in City Block Health, which is one of the most amazing stories in the book. This woman, Dr. Toyin Ajayi, I urge everyone to read that chapter.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some folks from Sidewalk Labs listening in who will be very excited to hear about the reference. We've got only a couple minutes before we switch over to Q&A, so folks should add their questions in there. And I want to spend our last couple minutes before the group Q&A talking a little more about how you do all these amazing things. Because as we've kind of in our conversation already, we've covered, your book, we've covered the Disruptor 50 list. Obviously, you are also a very seasoned reporter. You have a Closing the Gap initiative that you champion at CNBC. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of folks who are, either aspirationally or literally working on many projects at once. And I'm curious, like, what are some of your practical tips that you learned from adding a book into the mix for folks, balancing a very full list of projects themselves?
That's a great question. Sometimes I feel like I have the answer, and sometimes I feel like I'm failing across the board. I think it really helps if you're doing something that you love. And I think if you're adding a product, to make sure you're really passionate about it. I've always wanted to write a book, but I never really knew what the right topic was. I've worked on book proposals in the past, but never got them out the door. And the other book proposals felt like work. It felt like more homework, but not the good kind. And once I realized that this was the book I wanted to write, I was so excited about it that I was excited to wake up early and do it. So I think that, again, women are more likely to have purpose-driven companies, in part because having an additional purpose beyond just profits helps push you through when times get tough. And I felt this way about this book. I hope that this book would really help a lot of people. And I was just excited to get up in the morning, sometimes on the weekends at 5 a.m., to go through transcripts and to read these studies because I was so passionate about the topic. So I think if you're going to add something or create something, really find something that you're so excited about, because it's going to be a lot easier to work on it. And especially when times get hard. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I think a lot about is that I talk about with my husband is sort of being intentional about how I spend my time. One advantage of writing this book is that it was during the pandemic. There was no business travel. There were no social plans, especially at the beginning. There were no extra basketball games or all the stuff that had taken up so much time. And as things came back and as I, did more socializing, I just tried to be really thoughtful. And instead of just filling my calendar with all the things that came in, saying, do I really want to do this thing? Is this something I can say no to? Is it something I could push off? And just being really strategic. My husband and I meet every Sunday, or we have a conversation every Sunday, do our Google Calendar to make sure we know what we're doing. We're like, can we cancel that thing on Thursday? And just to be really thoughtful, and we're obsessed with Google Calendar, to make sure we're on the same page and also not overcommitting. And this is something I also think about in my work. And I feel like I procrastinate a lot less than I used to because I know what I'm supposed to be doing. So I have a lot of lists. I have lists everywhere. I like paper lists. I have these giant pieces of sticky notes. They're 2x3 sticky notes that I make lists on. And I feel like it just keeps me on track.
Yep. Yeah. I appreciate humanizing, how does this actually happen that you've done all these things? This is my last question before Q&A. So folks add in your questions. In the realm of humanizing folks who get a lot done. I think that sometimes when we see folks who are very polished and professional, just like you, people assume hey, that person's never made any of the dumb mistakes that I have. And I'm curious if you can tell us about a career mistake that you've personally made. And also if you have something like this to share, what's your self-talk when you wish that you had handled something differently?
Tomorrow's another day. I mean, I think one beauty of television is that, and I've made so many mistakes on television. But part of the beauty of it is you get to do it again tomorrow, and you screw up on TV. I fumble. I don't quite answer the question properly. I get to go back tomorrow and not mess up. So I do think there's something about just getting your reps in. And just having the practice to know it's going to be okay if I mess up, because I'm going to keep doing it again and again. And I think that sort of lowers the concern about taking risks, right? If you know you have more opportunity to take risks in the future, if you fail at one particular swing, that's okay. So I think for me, it's just reminding myself that there are more opportunities, and also sort of like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, I screwed up, like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, is this going to become a meme? Probably not. Like, and if it does, like, who really cares?
Yep.
And I actually think that having kids has helped me keep everything in perspective a lot more. But no, I've had all sorts of failures, and I've, like, most people I know had their days of crying in the bathroom at work and wishing I, could disappear. But I think also just trying, whenever I fail, one thing I think I've gotten very good at is like taking a breath and then being like, okay, what is the next challenge? Like, I failed at that challenge. Like, what's the next challenge I'm going to give myself? And one thing I always do at work is like, if I pitch a story and it like bombs, they're like, we definitely don't want that. I'm like, okay. Or if I do something that like doesn't quite work, I'm like, okay, I'm going to now come up with the 5 best ideas I've ever come up with to like keep moving it forward. So I just think it's important to like take your moment to suffer and then like set your own new goals and keep moving forward. And another thing I write a lot about in the book is the importance of setting very high goals and ambitious goals, and like figuring out, if this is your goal in 5 years, what's it going to take you to get there, and what should you start doing now? So I don't know. I mean, I have had so many different moments of feeling embarrassed or like I made a big mistake. It's almost hard to figure out which one to select. But I do think there is something nice about TV where you always get to try again the next day.
Yep, love that. Okay, let's switch over to Q&A. I've got a question coming from Whitney that is in a somewhat similar vein. She asks, what do you wish women interested in being leaders would do less of or stop doing?
Apologizing. Stop apologizing. This is, I'm not the first person to say this, but there's a great meme out there which shows, instead of saying I'm sorry for being late, or saying thank you for waiting for me. And just shifting the language. As a writer, I believe language is really important. And I think the words we choose to use around ourselves are really important to do. And that's part of the self-talk too. Like, I don't need to apologize. You don't need to apologize. And I always think, like, would my male colleague have apologized for that? What's the best way to acknowledge that maybe I did something wrong, but like that we're all moving forward here. So I think that's very, very important, is just stop apologizing. And be confident about everything you know. Like, I think that's a mistake women make a lot. The number of women I've met who say, I'm like, oh, where are you? What's your job again? They're saying, oh, I work at Warner Music Group. It's like, no, you're president of a division at Warner Music Group. So I feel like these conversations, I see it all the time. Women are sort of underselling their accomplishments because they don't want to seem intimidating. And I think we just need to get rid of that.
Yeah. And right in that vein, we've got a question coming from Vanessa. She asks about any advice you have to build confidence earlier in your career. And I imagine some of this might be tied to hey, women's confidence grows over time, but like, how do we nudge that a little bit forward?
I think it's about understanding what your areas of expertise are. And I think this ties into the question of vulnerability. It doesn't work if you're vulnerable about everything all the time, because then that seems performative too. Yep. I think to build confidence, build your areas of expertise and own the things that you know. And by the way, if you're young in a role, you may have the perspective of a young person. You might say, hey, I don't know about the way you've been doing it for the past 20 years, but I could tell you how people of my generation think about this. Or I have a new perspective, and you may just own the fact that you have a different and fresh perspective. So I think it's true. I think part of it is self-knowledge and understanding what your skill set is, what you could get better at, and how you're different from those who've been there for longer than you, or maybe those who are more confident than you. What do you have that's different than them that you bring to the table? Everyone has their strengths and their weaknesses, and I think the more that we can be honest with ourselves about them, the more we can be confident about what we're good at.
Yeah, I love that point about how, hey, being younger or less experienced is not necessarily actually a negative. 2 examples from my work life. One is that I subscribe to a lot of newsletters written by Gen Z folks who talk about shopping trends online and how, apps from China are influencing what's happening here in the US, or, a variety of different topics. And then also I sometimes get reverse mentors, where you actually have a mentor who is more junior than you, who then educates you on something that you don't know about that they are an expert in, because they spend all day thinking about that. So those are 2 good examples of where like there's so much benefit, no matter your age. Okay, I want to switch to a question now from Kat. The question is, how do you express empathy and vulnerability differently among different people? How do you champion these values with people who may not practice them?
This is a very complex question, and I feel like a longer conversation, because empathy and vulnerability are different things, right? Vulnerability is about yourself and trying to invite collaboration, I think. Empathy is really about the other person. How do you see, how can you see something from someone else's perspective? So I think it kind of depends on the situation. I know that's not a very good answer. But I think it's if you're a leader, I think the importance is to lead by example, show empathy, and explain, and maybe sometimes even demonstrate how you're using empathy to be better at your job, and saying, I'm relating to how you feel as maybe young people who don't want to come to the office, or I can relate to I'm relating to the concerns of our partner on this project. And so I think if you're a leader, it's show by example. And I think it just depends on the situation, because all of these sort of workplace dynamics, people who are your peers, people who report to you, people who you report to, those things are all different. But I think, again, with vulnerability, you don't want to be just vulnerable unilaterally. You want to be pairing that vulnerability with confidence. So you're taken more seriously at the things that you're good at, and you're honest about the things you need work at. And then empathy, I think that's really just about relationship building.
Yep. Absolutely. I want to talk more about relationship building, but in a slightly different vein. So we've got a question from, I believe, Naman. What's the best way to establish relationships at work when you have responsibilities at home, like young children, which I certainly do, and I know you have 2 sons as well, that limit your ability to attend social events or typical networking?
I try to be really efficient with my networking, in that if I go to New York for work, I'm based in Los Angeles, I will just jam in as much as I can. And so, or even if I have a day in LA where I know I have a work dinner, I will stack 2 meetings before it. So I try to commit to say, like, I'm going to be home. Yesterday was the first day of school. I was home. I'm going to be home tonight. But then next week, there are 2 nights when I'm going to go out, and I'm going to make the most of that time away from the kids. So just, again, intentionality, really trying to jam things in. I find conferences are really good for that. Sometimes if I get invited to industry dinners or events, and I know I'm going to get to knock out a lot of people that I need to see in one place, that's super efficient. And then the other thing that I think is important is follow up. If you've seen someone, if there's someone who you already have a good relationship with, I have a lot of phone relationships with my sources, people who I used to go out to drinks with or have lunch with. Now I just call them on the phone and we catch up. And I think that's sort of more of a post-COVID thing. But I think figuring out the people that you can transition to having a phone relationship with and maintain that, I think that's great. But having, reminders to check in with people, or if you see something that reminds you of someone, it enables you to maintain that relationship without having a lunch or dinner booked every night.
Yep. And the idea of jam packing in as much as possible really resonates with me. I'm going to London in a couple of weeks for a work trip, and emailed a bunch of folks I know to actually go have dinner together with me.
Perfect.
Probably even better for them. They meet some other folks.
Win-win.
Yeah, and being able to connect people, I also find to be interesting. Like, you don't even need to be there, but you can, continue that relationship by saying, "Hey, Julia, you love meeting so and so," and that takes me 30 seconds, but is kind of a benefit for everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've made it through many, but not all of our questions. But I think our event's soon wrapping up. Julia, last question for you. Tell us more about what you've learned from your book tour, and how that's been going.
It's been amazing. I think I've learned just as much on my book tour from all of the amazing people I've met, and the reaction to the book, as I have from writing the book itself. And it makes me realize there's a lot more work to be done. The number of men who told me that they were shocked by the statistics in the book and all of this research about pattern matching and the things that they may have overlooked as a result. I was actually surprised by how much they were shocked. And I think that was very illuminating. So I think this is a great book for men to read. And also, I think that women are more frustrated than I even could have imagined. And there was a study that came out late last fall from Lena and McKinsey about how women at the VP level and above are leaving their jobs in record numbers. And that has a massive ripple effect at every level of an organization. It's bad for the men at younger levels because they don't see more female types of leadership above them. It's bad for women. It's just not great all around to have senior women leaving. But when I have been on book tour, I continue to see evidence of this, and I continue to hear from women that they are frustrated that things aren't changing. And I think what's been most surprising to me is this idea that there's a real disconnect between the reality where now women get less than 2% of all venture capital funding. The reality is that there hasn't been that much progress. And then the perception, which is there's been massive progress in terms of gender equity in business. There's been some progress, but it's not massive. And there's a lot more work that's left to be done. If that work can be accomplished, if these gender gaps can be closed, it's going to be good for everybody, not just women, but for everybody. And I think just realizing these massive perception gaps that persist has been the most surprising thing for me.
Interesting. Yeah. And I feel like your work continues to highlight that in really good and very productive ways, which I know I really appreciate. And also just appreciate so much you joining Talks at Google. And thanks so much for everyone tuning in. Grab a copy When Women Lead. And thank you, Julia.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really a pleasure, Kelly.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.